Hey grade 7, it's Mr. Butler again. Now so far in this series of videos we've been looking at the differences between direct speech, also called dialogue, and indirect speech, which is also called reported speech. Now together in this Scratch document we've managed to put together a working definition for both indirect speech and direct speech, and we've also captured some typical use case scenarios for each type of speech too. Okay. Now what I'd like to look at today is something a little different. We're going to look at what I'm calling textual style conventions. Okay. Now what do I mean by that? Well, it sounds a lot fancier than it actually is. Okay. A convention is really just another word for rules. Okay. And how we capture speech in text types is very different depending on what type of text it is. Okay, so what do I mean by text type? Well, for example, a graphic novel is one form of text type. A newspaper article is another type of text type. Okay. So let's take a look at how speech is captured in different ways in different types of text, just to remind ourselves of how different it really can be. Okay, so let's take a look first at something we're all very familiar with, and that's a page from a graphic novel. Okay, now here we have a page from a graphic novel about Wonder Woman. Okay, so we have all of the stylistic elements that we're used to in a comic strip or a graphic novel. We have our frames, our black boxes or rectangles that break up the page. We have the graphic elements that describe the scenery and the characters. We have some textual elements that give some background or information. And we also have the speech elements themselves, which we see in these white speech bubbles that we're all so used to seeing. Okay? Now the text inside those bubbles has its own style elements. They're always in capital letters. The speech balloon itself usually has a tail which indicates which character is saying which lines. The text within the balloons is sometimes italicized or put into bold to give emphasis to particular words that characters are saying. Okay? Now those are very different stylistic rules than we might find, for example, in a stage play. Okay, so here's a stage play called Jasper Jones. Okay, now in this we see the names of characters down the left hand side in capital letters. We don't see any speech marks, but we then see direct speech from each character on their line, and we sometimes also see stage direction in italics. Okay, now let's take a look at something else again. So we've gone from theatre play now. Let's look at a TV screenplay. Okay, so this is one of my favourite TV shows, Bob's Burgers, and this is an episode called The Mothman Prophet Tease. Okay, so if we go to here, we can see this looks very different than a novel or a graphic novel, doesn't it? We've got a little bit of description at the top that says what some of the characters are doing, and then we have down the centre of the page the characters' names in bold, and then some of their speech, some of their direct speech immediately below it. Again, there's no speech marks. Okay, each character's speech is justified and carries on until the next character then speaks. Okay, stylistically looks very different, doesn't it? And if we then go back to Two Wolves, again, we have another set of conventions that we've grown used to because we see this, this material all the time. Okay. Now, in all those different types of speech that we've seen, in some types of text, there's really no difference between indirect speech and direct speech. Okay. So if we look at Hagar the Horrible again, we know that these two bubbles are direct speech. This bubble is indirect speech. But if we're looking specifically at the stylistic elements that we've got in these frames, there's really no difference, is there? We've got capital letters, we've got no speech marks, we've got a bubble and a bubble tail to indicate who's saying what. No difference, really, stylistically, no difference. But if we look at the difference in style in a standard piece of text, what we're going to call a standard piece of text, so a novel, a short story, a newspaper article, an informative text, okay, we do see a difference. So here we see a very different set of rules for how we write direct speech and how we write indirect speech, okay? So indirect speech is generally no differently written stylistically than the other narrative prose around it. No different, really. And we can say that carries on across all the different text types, really. Indirect speech really is no different than the other text around it. But direct speech generally has its own set of rules and conventions, okay? So I think we can begin to get something down now on the page that captures that. So let's look at our page here. So what we can say across text types, so graphic novels, comic strips, short stories, novels, newspaper articles, is that we can say indirect speech, reported speech, follows the same stylistic rules as the text surrounding it. Okay, it's really not that different. But when we look at direct speech, okay, there is a set of differences. So here, textual, style, conventions. I'm going to specifically talk here about standard text. Okay, and here I'm going to say there is a difference. Okay, so what I'm going to say here is I'm going to say the following are the standard set of rules that we need to follow. Here they are listed, 4 standard rules. So the first of them, the words actually spoken are enclosed within inverted commas, what we otherwise know as speech or quotation marks. Now sometimes we see single quotation marks, sometimes we see double quotation marks. Doesn't really matter, okay? Either is fine. We also see a rule that says the first word spoken in the actual speech always has a capital letter. The third rule is that when we change speakers, they require a new paragraph. And the final rule is there should be a comma, full stop, question mark, or exclamation mark at the end of a piece of speech. Now, use of whether it's a full stop or a comma is really determined by the position of the dialogue tag. Okay, and we'll talk about that more in the next video. Hyphens or ellipses can also sometimes be used for occasional dramatic effect. So hopefully that's given you an insight into how different text types represent different types of speech, whether direct or indirect speech, and we can see that there's a lot of material to cover when we're converting between different text types. Okay, so that's something we're going to explore in the next video.